When I was little, I loved animals. I remember really liking to lie under these quilts that my grandfather had and just look at the fabrics in them. I taught myself how to sew. I was a really skinny, long girl. If I wanted to wear anything that fit me, I needed to make it. I made an entirely homely dress. I wish I had a picture of it. From 7th through 12th grade, I had a wonderful art teacher, Nancy Kuhn. She was just phenomenal. She was interested in what was going on outside our little universe of the high school. She was keyed into the art movements in New York City and would give us assignments based on things that were very, very current. Because I grew up in New Jersey, I was right, we were 20 minutes from Manhattan. And I think I really liked that Mrs. Kuhn demanded of me and didn't let me fake it. She just kind of woke me up on a lot of levels. The summer of the year that I was going into 9th grade, I was kind of thinking that I was going to be a home ec major. You got to choose an elective major at my high school. I would be sewing and cooking. But that summer, my friend Barbara talked me into taking a summer course with Mrs. Kuhn. And it turned out to be such an interesting thing and so fun and so transformative and so alive that while I was away that summer on my own without asking my parents' permission, I called the high school and changed my major to be an art major. I had never done anything like that before in my life, and my father was furious. He really didn't think that was a good choice for me. He's like, what's a girl going to do with art? It was the most important decision I think I ever made. When I was growing up, my mom loved to talk for animals. It was a way that we would play together. My brother and I and Mom would all make up what animals were thinking and would say it for them in funny voices. The element of delight is something that was very alive in my relationship with my mom and still is very alive for me. She taught me about nature and loving nature and about the possibility that animals had inner lives. You know, it was play, but it's become much more than that for me. What it's become for me beyond play is, oddly enough, a spiritual path. I was invited in 1990 to go and try out this thing called shamanic journeying. And the first thing you learn in shamanic journeying is how to find your helping spirit in the form of an animal. And I was really entirely certain that this was not going to work for me. And I had a really powerful and beautiful experience, and out of that has grown a spiritual practice that feeds me and nurtures me and feeds my art, feeds the imagery of my art. And animals talk in it. Go figure. So my early education in the possibility of animals talking really just flowed right into this. It just made total sense, and all the love of nature that Mom taught me really feed into this too. The continuity of it is really, really pleasing to me. I think it was in 1989, maybe. I went to a quilt show and saw lots of quilts and old quilting fabrics, which I love. And there was a woman there with a tool called a punch needle, a little tiny embroidery tool. And she had 3 samples of the kind of stitching it would make. And I saw the sample of the tiniest needles stitching, and I just fell in love with the surface of it. I just thought that is the most beautiful thing. It was like, it's kind of like velvet, but not cut. It's all these little loops. It's a hollow needle. The thread flows through the tube of the needle, and there's a little eye at the pointy end, and you push the needle through the fabric, and when you draw it back up, it leaves a little loop on the side of the fabric you're not seeing, and that will be the side that's considered the right side ultimately. And so you just punch along, and the thread goes in and makes these little loops on the other side. So when I'm working, there's often a lot of turning the piece over to see how things are going. I use sewing thread. I can use 2 strands at a time in the needle, which is a great innovation over 1 strand because things go twice as fast, which in a minuscule world of sewing thread is a big improvement. When I first started making pieces, I was using solid colored quilting cotton as the fabric that I would stitch through. So now I use fabrics that are less tightly woven. They have to be tight enough to hold the loop in place because it's only friction that holds the loop in place. If they're too open, when you pull your needle back up to the side you're working on, the thread loop will come right with it and you won't have any stitching. I loved about the punch needle that it was small and I could see it all, and I loved that it was easy to take out the stitches if something wasn't going the way that I liked it to. And the color, the way that the color, because it's a loop, it has a highlight of color and a shadow of color. It makes it so rich. It's just beautiful. What I do when I'm making a thread painting is I have an idea and I do lots of little drawings and try to get a composition that looks good, and then I make it, the drawing, whatever size the piece is going to be. And that decision is made partly on how much tiny detail there is in it, because if there's detail, it can only be so small with the loop pile technique, the loop stitch. So I make the decision about the size of the piece and I transfer the drawing to the fabric. And then I start stitching with whatever color I know. I like not to do color sketches in advance because that was one of the things I really didn't like about weaving, was I had to make so many decisions before I started making the thing, and then I just was a laborer making the thing. So I start with whatever color I need, but I don't stitch it densely. I don't stitch it as densely as I want it in the finished piece. And I stitch lots of areas that way so that I can see the colors starting to come together. And it leaves also open the possibility that I can stitch through it with other colors that might blend the colors or shade them or tint them or even change them entirely. The thread paintings, when I started making them, were maybe 4 inches by 5 inches. I would say on the average now they're still under 12 inches. Occasionally there are ones that are in the forms of things, sometimes 3-dimensional, sometimes 2-dimensional shapes, like a woman holding a basket of flowers on her head, or one is a head and it has a whole landscape inside of it. I decided early on when I started making the thread paintings that I was going to present them in a traditional art kind of format, because there's always been this thing about textiles being seen as different than and maybe less than painting. And I wanted to try to make them seem more like painting. Just give people an opportunity to see them that way. There's something about the painting on the frame that responds to the piece that's in it. They're in a mat and they're under glass and they are in wooden frames that I paint. There's a lot in the presentation of a piece that shapes how somebody sees it. Shamanic journeying is a spiritual practice that's very, very ancient. It was practiced all over the world in, I think, probably every culture. I learned about shamanic journeying in a way that's taught as core shamanism. It's something that Michael Harner developed. He's an anthropologist and he noticed all of these similarities that these different shamanic cultural practices had, and so he kind of left behind all of the specific cultural practices and brought together the commonalities and taught that as core shamanism. When you start journeying, you go to meet your helping spirit in the form of an animal, which Harner calls your power animal. And then that spirit is your guide and your teacher and your friend. In my first journey, I saw the spirit of my first dog, Suki, my pet dog, who was no longer with me. And she showed up to point the way to my animal spirit. I saw this beautiful, beautiful big animal, and each time I saw it, it was different. The second time I saw it, it was like a lantern, as if it was glowing from inside. I was saying to this animal, you can't possibly be my helping spirit, you're too beautiful. The third time I saw it, it was right next to my face, and it said in my ear, take it, it's a gift. It brings tears to my eyes still. My experience of meeting that spirit was really the first time I had the experience of sort of unquestioned love. Like inside of myself, I really felt that. I know that my parents loved me that way, but there was something so pure about this experience in this journey that it sort of gave me a bigger world to live in. It was almost congruent with starting the punch needle. I think I had been doing the punch needle embroidery, my thread paintings. I think I started them maybe the year before. And before that, I had been a weaver, and I had been making woven pictures, and they often featured Suki, my dog, and my cats. But I often felt really stuck for imagery. It was a struggle to find imagery. As soon as I started the shamanic journeying, the imagery it made sense. There was so much imagery available through this process. There was just so much in my practice of it that was visual. And I think it might have been maybe the fourth or fifth thread painting I made that was a picture of one of the animal spirits, and it's just continued on from there. I have a big collection of fabric. I have a big collection of beads and buttons, and I've just always loved things that have to do with textiles and sewing and making clothes. And mostly I use sewing thread in these thread paintings, but I do get to use beads too. And my big collection comes in very handy because a lot of times I have what I need, but sometimes I don't, and then I have to go out and find it, and that's always fun, to go someplace where there's good beads. When my dog Emma died, Emma, who was such a beauty, in order to deal with the sorrow of her death, I made a piece about her, and it's called Emma is the Night's Garden. And it has some beautiful beads in it. It has just really lovely antique beads and some mother of pearl beads, and I was thinking of it as being a rectangular piece that would be in a frame, but then it seemed to want to be more than that, and I wanted to make it more like something that was a shrine to honor her and to remember her. And I was looking through my collection of ribbon, and I found these beautiful Japanese-looking ribbons that my friend Jane gave me. And so I used those. They made the perfect border for this piece, and added this other level of connection to the piece for me. This is a piece that I will never sell because it's so, so dear to my heart. And then it has a beautiful frame that has a little hook so that the glass opens so that it seems more like a shrine. So on the back of the thread paintings, the stitching is very beautiful, and I thought, well, I could make some three-dimensional pieces where the back side of the stitching would be a part of the piece too, as well as what I think of as the front side of the stitching. I've made some animals that were fun, horses and some mythical animals, and I made some nice flowers that way. I really like the flowers. Each flower was a time in a summer day in a garden, and they had beads on both sides of the pieces, and the sides can have very different qualities. I've made some pieces that I think of more as objects, and I'm not really sure what distinguishes them. Maybe that they seem like they might have some sort of ritual use. Fans and masks. I made a piece called A Mask, a Mirror. It had a little handle that was carved out of wood and painted that went with the image of the embroidery. I like to make pieces that reflect the passage of time. So in the border there might be something about the morning and the afternoon and the dusk and the evening. I like to make pieces that have something to do with either the four directions or the four elements. I think I'm drawn to the idea of the elements and the directions. I think that that's a link to the shamanic practice, because it seems to be such so integrated into shamanism, that shamanism springs from nature, springs from the earth and the air and the fire and the water. The pieces come to life as they're made. That's really what I want from them. I want them to become themselves. I want them to become a whole thing, a whole world in itself. And there's an amazing amount of information available in the spirit of this piece, in this engagement that I can have with the spirit of this piece as I'm working on it. The imagery comes from this place in my heart and this deep connection that I have, and the images that I see in the shamanic journeying, which feels like such an incredible gift to me, that it is so valuable and such, I never imagined that I would have that in my life. It's such, it's filled with such sweetness and such beauty that if I'm going to freeze frame a little bit of that and try to instill it in my artwork, then I have to be respectful of it and honoring of it and just do my best. Just do my best. And some days my best is better than others, but that's what I try to do. My relationship to my thread paintings is just so entirely different than my relationship to my earlier work, because of the place that many of them spring from. They come from this connection to my spiritual practice, which I didn't have when I was doing the woven things. And I felt a little adrift that way. And so the thread paintings have this I don't even have a word big enough for it, connection to all sorts of aspects of me as a person, to my emotions, to my thoughts, to my fears, to my longings, to my happinesses, to my past, all of these connections. And every experience of a journey has some of that in it. And it's just this pure goodness. I think my making my artwork is saying thank you to whatever these spirits are, to whatever the force is that brings these images to me. It's a way of saying thank you and honoring it. And I also see it hopefully as a way of passing it along. I feel like that kind of ineffable stuff clings to my pieces. This is my hope. And that when they go out into the world and people view them, if people are in the right place to receive it, it's there for them. So in that way, I hope that it kind of gets passed on. And when I see people look at my work, if I'm having a show or something, I'll see somebody go around and look at pieces, and all of a sudden there's one they connect with, and I think that's what I'm talking about. That's what I'm hoping for, is that moment of some kind of recognition between the piece and the person viewing it. Because they're still alive to me then. They're still their own beings, and they have work to do or play to do or whatever it is that they do out there in the world.